Hey, welcome back, everybody. We are reading Copper Sun by Sharon Draper, and we are now on the last chapter of part one, which is chapter 13, Slave Auction, from Amari's point of view. The next day, the slaves were taken in groups from the ship. The women were placed in small boats, similar to the ones that had taken them away from their homeland. Fewer boats were needed to unload the surviving slaves than when they had started out. As he helped her from the ship into one of the small boats, Bill refused to look at Amari directly. He mumbled into her ear, "Be brave, child. God have mercy on you." Amari glanced back to see him, but he was gone. The rowers were swift and the journey was short. It took only a few minutes to reach the beach on the place they called Sullivan's Island. Chained and pushed, Amari was unloaded with the others. She tried to walk, but she kept falling onto the sand. Her legs felt like they were made of mashed fufu. She glanced around and saw that most of the slaves, and some of the sailors as well, had difficulty adjusting to land after such a long time journeying on the ocean. A long, well-trodden path lay in front of them. Tall grasses grew in abundance on either side of it. 3 solemn seabirds flew overhead. All was unusually silent. When most of the slaves were able to walk, they were led to a large building about half a mile from the beach. It was made of wood and stone, a smaller version of the prison at Cape Coast. None of their captors spoke to them, except to yell or curse, nor did they try to explain what was happening. Talk surrounded them. However, as one slave was pointed to with great interest or another was laughed at. The slaves were fed, given water, and even supplied with extra water in small basins with which to bathe. Their wounds were patched or covered, and they were oiled and prepared for whatever was to come next. The whole area was full of nervous tension. A tall black man entered the room. He limped noticeably, and he was dressed in a ragged version of the clothing of the whites. He looked at them, shook his head sadly, then addressed the slaves in the white language, seemingly giving instructions. They gazed at him blankly. Finally, as soon as all the white men had stepped outside the building, the black man switched to the Ashanti language, speaking quickly and softly. "Listen, my brothers, I know not all of you can understand me, but I can see that some of you are Ashanti and Yue. I'll be whipped if they catch me talking African, as they call it, but I must tell you some things. You must learn their language quickly. It is called English, but try not to forget your own. Submit and obey if you want to live. You're at a place called Sullivan's Island, where you will be kept for 10 days, until they are sure you have no disease. Smallpox is the worst. Then you will be taken to a place called Charlestown, where you will be sold to the highest bidder." A white soldier re-entered the building, and the black man smoothly switched back to the language of the whites. The black man, whom the soldiers called Tai B, passed out some rough garments for them to wear, a simple smock for the women, a shirt and trousers for the men. He told them the names of each item in English as he gave it to them. Shirt, schrift, apron. Then pointed out other words they would need, like massa, yes'm, and yes, sir. Amari was surprised and pleased that she was able to understand quite a few of the words he said. They stayed there on the island for several days, waiting for the unknown. During the day, the slaves were fed and their wounds were treated, but at night, fear was the blanket that covered each of them. Amari lay on the ground one particularly hot night, trying to escape into sleep. She curled herself into a ball, but as she closed her eyes, memories assaulted her. So she sat back up, leaning against the rough wooden wall. She looked over and was surprised to see Bessa had worked his way as close to her as he could in spite of his chains. She quickly lowered her head. "My lovely Amari," he greeted her quietly in their language, as if hope still shone in their sky. "How goes your day?" "Better, now that you are here," she said, remembering sadly that day that seemed so long ago. "But I am no longer lovely, and my days will never be happy again." She tried not to cry. "When you look at the sun and the stars," he whispered, "I want you to remember me and smile. I want you to know that you will always be my lovely Amari." One of the guards noticed them talking then and slashed at Bessa with his whip. Bessa glared at him, but he understood the danger of retaliation. He allowed himself to be led back to the far side of the men's area, where the guard kicked him fiercely. Amari had to look away. Early the next morning, the slaves were once again shackled and packed into boats. Looking healthier and feeling stronger than they had in a very long time, they were ready for sail. The shoreline, Amari noticed as they were unloaded at the place their captors called Charlestown, was rocky and harsh rather than soft beach. Amari looked then at an amazing sight. Tall buildings and people, seemingly everywhere, crowded the area. What has happened to the trees? She thought. And what are all these structures? Surely these white people must have great magic to make such buildings. There are so many of them. Afi, Amari whispered, the faces of brown and black that I see, are they slaves? I cannot tell for sure, but I think so, Afi whispered back. Most of them do not seem to walk with authority. I think we have arrived in a backward world, where black skins are few and not respected, and pale skins seem to rule, Amari commented quietly. They were taken to a place that Amari heard them call the custom house. It was a big, drafty building with a large door. Pushed into a small shed next to it, the slaves waited in silence on the dirt floor. The sun rose, the room began to get unbearably hot, the hours passed, and the sun set again. They were given food and water at the end of the day, then locked back into the shed for the night. Amari, hot and sweaty, whispered to Afi, What are they waiting for? Buyers, Afi declared. Amari's stomach clenched with fear. Early the next morning, white men lined up the slaves, sloshed cold water on them, and had other slaves rub oil all over their bodies. The oil stank, and Amari coughed at the odor. Now it begins, Afi said sadly. By the time the sun had begun to shine brightly, the sale had started. Bessa and a coffle of men were taken as the first to be auctioned off. As he and the others were led from the holding area, a great cry of enthusiasm could be heard from the crowd outside. Amari could hear loud, excited words tossed back and forth, much like the tones of bargaining her mother had used on market days. She heard someone say the word "sold," and she knew she would never see Bessa again. The rest of the men, some in sets of 2 or 3, some singly, were sold as the morning went on. By midday, it was time for the women. In spite of the heat, Amari trembled. She gazed out of the shed's single window at the sun, which glistened bright and harsh. No warmth, no soft shadows to hide her embarrassment, no hope. She wondered how the sun could shine so brightly on this land of evil people. Nothing made sense to her any longer, not days or nights, not past or present. This was the summer of her 15th year, and this day she wanted to die. More buyers had arrived. Afi and Amari and the other women were stripped naked. Amari bit her lip, determined not to cry, but she couldn't stop herself from screaming out as her arms were wrenched behind her back and tied. A searing pain shot up through her shoulders. A white man clamped shackles on her ankles, rubbing his hands up and down her legs as he did. Amari tensed and tried to jerk away, but the chains were too tight. She could not hold back the tears. Amari shuffled in the dirt as she was led into the yard and up onto a raised wooden table, which she realized gave the people in the yard a perfect view of the women who were to be sold. She looked at those faces in the sea of pink-skinned people who stood around pointing at the captives and jabbering in their language as each of the slaves were described. She looked for pity or even understanding, but found nothing except cool stares. They looked at her as if she were a cow for sale. She saw a few white women fanning themselves and whispering in the ears of well-dressed men. Their husbands, she supposed. Most of the people in the crowd were men. However, she did see a poorly dressed white girl about her own age standing near a wagon. The girl had a sullen look on her face, and she seemed to be the only person not interested in what was going on at the slave sale. Amari looked up at a seabird flying above and remembered her little brother. I wish he could have flown that night, Amari thought sadly. I wish I could have flown away as well. All right. And we end chapter 13. This is one of the slave auctions, which we'll see more of next chapter. One of the most embarrassing and humiliating, one of those humiliating aspects of being in slavery. In this case, Amari was actually stripped naked and had to stand in front of everyone. And while all these people you don't know are just staring at you like you're a piece of meat or an animal. So we do see that the Sailor Bill, he is, and you'll see this theme, so on and so forth. Amari, this is the first nice white person that she's met. And it takes to note that slavery was the way of the world back in the 1700s. There were certain white people periodically throughout the centuries and decades who did not agree with slavery. There wasn't much a lot of them could do, especially if you're poor or working class at the time. they helped where they could. And that's where Bill, the sailor, as you could tell, he wanted to teach her his language. He tried to save her from rape as often as he could. And he tells her to be brave, have mercy on you, because what does Bill know? Right? Bill knows what horrors are about to happen to her. He's a fairly old man. He has his own kids. So he's seen how people treat slaves. So he's seen the worst, and you can tell he's like he's worried about it, but there's not much he can do. And you'll notice because slaves are expensive. You will notice, and you may have heard in some social studies classes, that usually the richer you were, the more slaves you had. Slaves cost a lot of money. So they're profitable, and Bill, if he could, probably maybe he would have bought her and treated her well. But we have no way of knowing. So just wanted to go over that. As you can see, they had to use other Africans to communicate with the slaves that they took from Africa. And even then, they didn't want them talking their language. You'll see more. It's very ignorant. They have a perception of Africans and of African Americans and Black people and people who are not like them in general. So, but anyway, we're finishing up this. Our next chapter will be from Polly's point of view, which will be chapter 14. So thanks for reading with us, and we'll see you on the next one.